My sense is that China's assertiveness and its actions in the Pacific and Southeast Asia aren't all bad. This is actually presenting significant investment opportunities. It's presenting challenges for us to think about how we should respond in the neighbourhood. And that's a good and healthy thing. So I say, hey, let's rise to the occasion. Let's do more with our neighbours. Let's help them, help themselves, and help us. Diesel electric submarines, newer ones, are not viable in my view, in part because China, amongst others, has almost saturation low Earth polar orbit satellite coverage of the routes that Australian submarines follow.
Hello and welcome back to The Focus. With billions of dollars at stake and Australia's future security hanging in the balance, the AUKUS agreement has sparked both hope and controversy. Is this partnership a game changer for Australia's defence, or does it risk dragging us into conflicts not of our making? Today we're joined by Professor John Blaxland, a leading expert on Australian national security, to break down the strategic realities, the myths, and what AUKUS truly means for Australia's place in the world, right here on The Focus. John, welcome back to The Focus.
John, good to be with you. Thanks for having me back.
John, some say that AUKUS makes our Southeast Asian neighbours uneasy. Recent defence pacts with countries like Indonesia suggest otherwise. How do you interpret the mixed reactions from Australia's neighbours? Are they genuinely concerned, or are their concerns more diplomatic in nature?
Yeah, great question. So my sense is that there was genuine concern when it was first announced because it was sprung on the neighbours. They weren't given advance warning. It wasn't handled very well. But 3 years later, our diplomats have been working assiduously to make sure that they are consulted, that they're informed, that there's a degree of transparency about Australia's intentions and plans. And that has generated a much greater acceptance of Australia's ambitions and its intentions alongside the United Kingdom and United States for Australia to gain access to nuclear propulsion technology for submarines, for the next generation submarines. There's still no doubt a lot of differences of views in the different countries. From country to country, you'll get a relatively enthusiastic support from the Philippines, and you get muted but fairly positive vibes from the Singaporeans, from Indonesia, from Vietnam, and others, probably countries like Thailand, not particularly swayed one way or the other, but don't want to necessarily go too far out on a limb in declaring their hand one way or the other. So there's a variety of perspectives across Southeast Asia. This is one of the interesting things about Southeast Asia, the incredible degree of diversity. They talk about unity in diversity, but it's more of an aspirational statement than a statement of fact.
Yep, sure is. But when we talk about the Southeast Asian states, there is a genuine concern, I suppose, that they get sort of wedged between this sino-american Cold War, and they have to pick sides. And really, they don't want to pick sides. They want to have the benefit of being under the protective umbrella of the United States on the one side, and they want to have the luxury of having trade with China on the other, pretty much like Australia. So how does that fit into the whole Southeast Asian imbroglio?
Well, that's kind of like everybody, though, John. Everybody wants to keep trading with China, and no one wants to stop that. And let's not forget, we're actually not at war. We're actually in a heightened period of what I call strategic unrestricted competition, to be fair, but no one's shooting at us. So I think it's really important to make it clear that when we say people are being asked to make a choice about what? About trading? No, we're not going to stop trading. Or about security alliances. We've already made that choice. Choices are made on a daily basis about policy decisions, about reactions to circumstances, to events in the region, to events globally, to calls for unified action in response to a security or a trading or an environmental or climate related issue. these are not, they're not binary and they're not permanent. They ebb and flow, and interests are calculated, and countries make decisions based on their perceived interests and the benefits that accrue on the day. So I'm wary of people who say, oh, you know, which camp are you in? Every country has a right to pursue its interests. And when they think about national power, they're thinking about a spectrum of components of national power, including their trade, investment, their geographic circumstances, their security circumstances, the demographic circumstances. There's so many variables there that every country has a right to make a call on in their own way. So, yeah, it's multifaceted. It's not, the question belies a more complex set of circumstances.
Well, yeah, that was a very reasonable unpacking of the situation, John. I must say, excellent work there. But really, when you look at the headlines and you look at some of the commentary, from seasoned scholars, we've got the likes of Professor Niall Ferguson on the one side saying we're in Cold War 2.0. Are these shrill, headline-grabbing headlines, if you will, are these things not really acting in the best interest of all countries in the Indo-Pacific and further afield? Because quite frankly, you would think that from all the rhetoric being bandied about, we are kind of locked into some sort of existential struggle with China.
So I'm wary of painting things in those stark binary terms. I know there's an inclination in journalism and even some academics who write for newspapers to use pejoratives, to use adjectives that are alarmist and alarming. And I just think it's really important that we tone things down and speak in measured word, using measured words, and with some nuance as to what's at stake. Because, we have a lot of options. The countries have agency. This isn't just about China and the United States. The other East Asian countries have agency. Southeast Asia has agency. Australia, India, and others have agency. We all have a role to play in fostering security and stability and enabling ongoing prosperity as well. They're all interlinked. I'm uncomfortable with the concept of a Cold War 2.0, partly because the first Cold War was quite a distinctive. It was very different to what we're facing today, I believe. The world was not as interconnected as it is today. There are echoes of it, to be sure. There are features that resonate, but we're living in a much more interconnected world. We've gone through a period of through globalization in the post-Cold War years, a degree of interconnectedness that really it makes a mockery of the idea that you can be in one camp or another camp. We're all interacting with each other. Even the United States, with its talk of sanctions and tariffs and things like that, is still heavily invested. And China is heavily invested, conversely, in the United States. So there's an interconnectedness that belies this simple idea of a binary, one side or the other. Just that kind of distillation of complexity into an absurd simplicity, I don't think is helpful and doesn't reflect reality. And for some, it's probably convenient to try and use that. Perhaps that those who are looking to extract some kind of concession or to embarrass or to cajole, it can be a convenient foil, but it doesn't reflect what I think is reality. And it's certainly not what I think erudite scholarly discussion and debate should dumb down towards. We should avoid that.
Well, speaking about dumbing down a very complex issue, let's dig a little deeper, shall we? Critics argue that AUKUS increases the likelihood of conflict, particularly over Taiwan, by adopting a more aggressive posture towards China. How do you see the balance between deterrence and provocation? Is Australia risking regional instability by participating in this pact?
So I'm actually not overly concerned about a war over Taiwan. The only way a war over Taiwan is likely to emerge, in my view, is if China feels it has such a dominant position that it can win confidently and with little prospect of severe repercussions. And that is, in my view, unlikely under the current circumstances and unlikely in the foreseeable future. Conversely, there are those who say, our support for the United States means we're going to encourage a warmonger kind of attitude in the United States. And look, I'm living in the United States now. I'm mindful that this is a country where it's got a very big defence industry and a big defence force, but there's a greater recognition, more acute consciousness today, I would say, of the limits of America's power than there have been in generations. So while there are those who say, American adventurism will lead us into a war, I think that kind of hubris, that moment of hubris has passed. I think it ended with the catastrophic events in Afghanistan and Iraq over the last couple of decades. My reading of the United States today, and even with either side of the Democrats or the Republicans coming out on top of the next election, is a much more a restrained sense of American power on the world stage. So, looking at it from a Chinese point of view, there's huge vulnerabilities arising for them were they to seek to be adventurous and to try and seize Taiwan. Conversely, if it was the United States, there's a greater recognition that this is not something that they want to trigger. There's the prospect of a Tonkin Gulf incident like echo from which was used to trigger the Vietnam War today is, in my view, more particularly unlikely. There is a greater awareness of the risks. There is a greater sense of the limits of American power, the spectrum of challenges it faces elsewhere in the world, and the fact that it faces too many competitors for them to, in a cocky manner, go off half-baked in confronting China in East Asia.
John, how would you describe Australia's approach to diplomacy? How effective have we been, or how creative have we been in balancing deterrence and cooperation with China, while also maintaining strong relationships with non-aligned Southeast Asian and Pacific nations, where a lot of the competition seems to be taking place, at least from an Australian perspective?
Yeah, so I think we've been a bit patchy, to be honest. At some stage, we've been a bit clod hopping. The way we've treated Indonesia over the years has been very ham-fisted. I like to say we play a game of snakes and ladders with Indonesia. We climb the ladder incrementally, and then we trip ourselves up and down the snake slippery slope. We slide over beef, over boats, over spies, over clemency, over Timor, over Papua, over Jerusalem, you name it. We're fairly unsophisticated in our engagement with our neighbours, our critically important neighbours, particularly Indonesia. But I have to say, over the last few years, I've been really heartened by the approach I've seen from the Foreign Affairs Department under Penny Wong. I think there's a sophisticated approach emerging, and my sense is that this has garnered bipartisan support, this recognition that we need to manage our relationships in Southeast Asia and the Pacific with more deference, with more respect, and with more appreciation of their interests and their sensibilities. So this is generating, and it's generated very positive feedback in the Pacific, with the Pacific Policing Initiative recognised by the Pacific Islands Forum, and in Southeast Asia, in part with the ASEAN-Australia Summit that happened in Australia not that long ago, and of course the new Enhanced Defence Cooperation Agreement signed between Australia and Indonesia. And there are critics out there who say, did you see what Kurt Campbell said at that PIF when he kind of sleight of hand about Australia being, kind of like doing America's bidding in the Pacific? I just think that's a completely conspiratorial view of looking at something, a fairly benign, kind of almost comical exchange between Albanese and Campbell, that people like to extract from these things deep conspiratorial implications that I just think are not there.
Okay, so You know, when I was at the University of Adelaide lecturing in Asian Studies, I had a little bit of a course talking about Australia's role in the region, and we used to always claim that Australia was a liminal power, you know, neither fish nor fowl, not part of the region, but in the region. Does AUKUS pull Australia back into its Anglosphere roots, which could undermine its regional engagement with the Asia Pacific? In your view, is this a step backward for Australia's international positioning, or is it a necessary move to ensure security while maintaining strong regional ties?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Australia's struggled with a number of dialectics, kind of alternative worldviews and issues. You know, we've had forward defence, we've had defence of Australia, we've had focus on the neighbourhood, focus on the Anglosphere, we've had, alliance or dependence or independence, self-reliance or otherwise. Uh, my sense is that, look, our neighbours understand that we're a transplanted Anglo-European country on the edge of Asia. They also increasingly recognise that we're quite a cosmopolitan country, quite an inviting country. And people talk about Australia being racist. Well, policy-wise, that's clearly not a valid accusation to level at the Australian government or the Australian people. There are pockets of it, but racism exists everywhere. You know, our neighbours in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, by and large, recognise that. They don't want to call it out too loudly because they don't want bit like the pot calling the kettle black. No country is free of racism. Many countries have explicit racist policies. So Australia is actually quite a model country in that respect. And as I say, we've seen a real remarkable progress in terms of migrants from a lot of the countries in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Australia today is a much more diverse, much more inclusive country than ever before. It's not perfect. It's got its limitations. But the fact that you can have someone like Penny Wong as our foreign minister, a Malay Bahasa speaking, migrant daughter of Malay Chinese as our foreign minister, I think that speaks volumes about how Australia has come a long way in the 55 years since under Harold Holt we moved away from the White Australia policy in 1967. So it's, Australia's a transformed nation. It's not the White Australia of old. It's not that cringe-worthy kind of neo-colonial country of old. It's a much more respectful, inclusive, diverse country than ever before. Sure, it's got its problems. Sure, it's got its difficulties in relating to its neighbours. I mean, for most of us, Australians, what I like to say is we're barely monolingual. We don't speak many languages. We're not particularly culturally attuned to our neighbours, but I think we're getting broadly better at that. And our neighbours actually, by and large, like us. They may not necessarily altogether shout it from the rooftops. It's not in their interests to do so. But the relations bilaterally and multilaterally are, by and large, on pretty good terms. We rub up on specific issues now and then, but I think on the whole, we're on pretty good terms.
On that very fact, I mean, I suppose there's always room for improvement, but when it comes to our position in the Asian area, what effect had the cutting back of foreign language services from Radio Australia into the region had on our diplomacy? And also, you raised language, and I totally agree with you. But why has the government, or why have successive governments pulled back on focusing on Asian languages at our schools, at our universities, in order for us to better understand the cultures to the north of us? I mean, I think that if we're looking at trying to position Australia as a solid member of our part of the world, we really need to do more. But no government has been prepared really since the Keating years to put a lot of emphasis on this.
Yeah, no, you're right, John. So the Radio Australia termination was a terrible own goal. That was a grave mistake. I think there's a growing recognition in Australia that was a mistake. We need to be actively reversing that. And the government's made some initiatives that way. I think it was partly kind of a partisan political move that saw Radio Australia somehow associated with the left of politics in Australia, which I think was an unreasonable conclusion to reach. Radio Australia was providing a very important service, and the vacuum was filled by other voices that were not necessarily consistent with Australia's interests.
Yeah.
So I think I like to make the point that we're in what I call unrestricted competition. It riffs off the title of a book called Unrestricted Warfare, written by a couple of Chinese colonels in the late 1990s.
Yeah, I know that one.
Which kind of, a lot of people recoiled from it because we in the English language have a binary between peace and war. And we don't, no one's shooting at us, so why would you use the word warfare? And I think that's a fair point. So my sense is, but if you take the word warfare out and put competition in, that's, I think, pretty well we're having unrestricted competition in the legal, media, psychological, and economic domains. And look, that's fair to a point, I guess. It's part of international relations. You compete, you pursue your own interests. We should be doing it too. We should be, getting on the footy field and playing our positions and pursuing our interests. That may not be congruent or consistent with the interests of others we're competing against. But let's not shy away from it because somebody is afraid that we might be causing some kind of offence. Let's just look for partners, look for neighbours who are interested, and of course along the way learn some local languages. This has been another own goal, the retreat from languages, which in my mind, anecdotally, I connect with the post-Bali bombings phenomenon. We had, Indonesian learning language schools programs in the 1980s and 90s that were blossoming, that in the early 2000s kind of came to a screeching halt because people all of a sudden thought, oh, this idea of the Southeast Asia being a land of opportunity became a land of potential threat. I think those days are gone. We've seen a withering of Jemaah Islamiyah. We've seen a deepening of security and institutional and economic ties with our neighbours, in educational ties as well, particularly with Indonesia, which has manifested itself in the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, a remarkable amount of goodwill towards Australia, not only with Joko Widodo, the outgoing president, but his successor, Prabowo Subianto. And across Southeast Asia, Australia is recognised as being a respectful and important partner, a safe anchor to the south, if you like. And I use as an example two instances. One, that the Cambodian peace accord of the early 1990s, where Australia, along with Indonesia and others, played a broker role. Yeah. And the other one is the East Timor intervention of 1999, where Australia relied on other ASEAN partners, particularly Thailand and then the Philippines, and then others in Southeast Asia as well, to collaborate with us and to engage with Indonesia in a way that avoided that becoming an even greater bloodbath than it already was. And since then, we've worked closely with Indonesia over Aceh, over counter-terrorism cooperation, on education programs, on a whole range of initiatives that are of mutual benefit. Similarly, interestingly enough, in the Pacific, we've seen a resurgence in enthusiasm for investing in development and aid and education and security programs, partly because of the competition we're getting from China and elsewhere. But I think that's a healthy thing. It's good. We want to see these programs doubling down in investing in making sure that the people in the Pacific are looked after, that they remain our friends, and that we do the right thing by them as they face an increasingly existential challenge presented by climate change and storms and things like that.
John, if we could just return to something that you mentioned earlier about the game that's being played in the whole sino-american narrative, right? That so-called Cold War 2.0 thing that's doing the rounds. From the Chinese perspective, what do you understand they see in terms of AUKUS? Do they see this as a deliberate provocation of their, to them, legitimate national security needs and requirements? I mean, or is, again, this is just an extension of that whole game that we were talking about earlier, where no one really means what they mean. They're just going about it because they're positioning themselves because of this very thing that you just mentioned, unrestricted competition.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, we've heard a lot of kind of vociferous opposition in words from China about AUKUS.
Yeah.
And I can perfectly understand why they don't want AUKUS to happen. It complicates life for them. It makes security planning that much more difficult. It also pushes Australia more firmly into America's camp, and that's something China has been working to undermine. It also has a demonstration effect on countries in the neighbourhood in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. They see that actually working more closely with the United States isn't necessarily something that's going to be problematic for them. And so we've seen that with Indonesia and other countries in the Pacific, especially reaching out, looking to do more with the United States, and the United States also recognising the utility, along with countries like Japan and others, to do more in this space as well, and to not just vacate the field to Chinese initiative because, it's in a fatalistic way, thinking that there's nothing we can do. China doesn't want AUKUS because it's not in China's interests for AUKUS to flourish. But it is, I would argue, in Australia's interests for Australia to be better positioned with more robust defence capabilities, with more robust relationships with our security partners and our neighbours, and in so doing, present more of a competitive challenge to China, and to give our neighbours a sense of assurance that Australia has got their back, that Australia is actually a good neighbour, a partner neighbour, one that's prepared to invest in development, in education, in responding to climate change, etc., in a positive way. So it's a bit like, I view it a bit like the kind of the space race of the Cold War. Sputnik went up in 1957 and then Yuri Gagarin was up there not that long afterwards, and the Americans got the shock of their lives, but it spurred them on to put humans on the moon by the end of the 1960s. That was extraordinary. That wouldn't have happened had the Soviets not challenged America to rise to the occasion. My sense is that China's assertiveness and its actions in the Pacific and Southeast Asia aren't all bad. This is actually presenting significant investment opportunities. It's presenting challenges for us to think about how we should respond in the neighbourhood. And that's a good and healthy thing. So I say, hey, let's rise to the occasion. Let's do more with our neighbours. Let's help them, help themselves, and help us. This is a win-win, in my view. So it's looking at competition as a healthy thing, not as a zero-sum catastrophe.
Okay, speaking about zero-sum catastrophes, I have to raise this point. Does AUKUS make Australia more dependent on the US, and does it deny it agency in defence decisions? Do you see Australia's deepening reliance on US technology and military cooperation as a risk to our sovereignty, or is it an essential part of maintaining strategic strength in the Indo-Pacific?
So is it a risk to our sovereignty? Shannon Tao wrote a great book called Independent Ally, which is a contrast to the book by Coral Bell called Dependent Ally. And there's kind of two sides of this dialectic, if you like, of this points of tension in Australia's a sense of identity and sense of engagement with the world. We have long relied on American technology. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. Our Navy has US warfighting systems that are dependent on software upgrades from the United States. Our Air Force is almost entirely dependent on US technology. And our existing Collins submarines have US warfighting systems on board. So yes, we're going to go up a notch with nuclear propulsion. So there's another level of engagement, but this is actually a two-way street. This actually brings the United States more to the defence of Australia, makes us having greater access to American technology for the benefit of Australia in the pursuit of our interests. And, you know, this is, in my estimation, this is a net positive for Australia. We have long depended on the qualitative edge that comes from technological prowess, largely sourced from the United States, as a compensator for our quantitative shortcomings, the shortage of personnel and the shortage of kit, the numbers of kit. So we've always aimed for the best we can get. And of course, when you're looking to get the best kit you can, you want it to be as networked as possible with potential security partners. And who else is getting things like the F-35? Well, Japan, Singapore, the United, the Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, potential security partners of Australia have or are getting the F-35, right? Similarly, with some of the combat systems on the Navy ships and on the submarines, these are systems compatible with allies and security partners. So the networked effect of operating in American systems gives you potentially, in extremis, the ability to network with people who aren't necessarily allied with you. Korea, Japan, we're not allies with them. We've got security relationships with them, but without too much effort, you can quickly turn the switch. Because of these levels of interoperability, you can leverage the connections with partners. That gives you diplomatic advantage. This gives you additional leverage, and this gives them additional leverage as well. And that's not, it's not 1914. There's no guarantees, there's no obligations. And even with ANZUS, there's no obligations. ANZUS, let's not forget, has no guarantees, no Article 5 like NATO of mutual defence guarantee. There's no commanding headquarters or commanding general or forces assigned. It's actually pretty loosey-goosey. But what we have is the benefit for Australia of access to technology that gives us a qualitative advantage way beyond the 2.1% of GDP we spend on defence that would otherwise be entitled to claim.
I'm John Brewin, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. From Washington, D.C., we're speaking with Professor John Blaxland, a leading Australian commentator, author, and expert on Australian national security. John is also director of the Australian National University North America Liaison Office and Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies in the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, Corabell School of Asia Pacific Affairs, College of Asia and the Pacific at the Australian National University. John, AUKUS Pillar 1 is all about giving Australia nuclear-powered submarines for the Royal Australian Navy. Given that Australia's existing diesel-electric submarines face obsolescence, proponents of AUKUS say nuclear propulsion is the only viable alternative. Do you believe nuclear submarines are indispensable for Australia's security needs, or are there other less controversial options?
So, look, let's just unpack the options. Diesel electric submarines, newer ones, are not viable in my view, in part because China, amongst others, has almost saturation low Earth polar orbit satellite coverage of the routes that Australian submarines follow, transiting from Fremantle to the Straits of Malacca, Lombok, Sunda, Weta, or to the ports around Australia's coast. Combine that with pattern analysis. They've had 30 years of pattern analysis to actually discern the patterns of Australian submarine operations. Combine that with artificial intelligence, and then combine that with drones. Diesel electrics are now more vulnerable than ever. If you put your snorkel up to recharge your batteries, the wake of that snorkel at sea is detectable. And if you are detectable, you're targetable, in which case you should pack up and go home. Now, people say, oh, well, what about air-independent propulsion? Sure, air-independent propulsion gives you less frequent snorting. You still have to snort. But you also don't get the advantage you get with nuclear propulsion of an incredible surge in speed and endurance. So you can transit, people say, 20 knots is the standard operating rate, but you can surge to 30 plus knots, which means you can get somewhere really quickly and you can get out of harm's way really quickly. And that is, so in terms of survivability, that's critical. So another one people put up is, oh, what about drones? I said, okay, look, drones are definitely part of the mix, but people forget that seawater in particular attenuates signals dramatically. It's actually very hard to communicate underwater over a long distance. Extremely low frequency, very low frequency communications from Northwest Cape is what we tend to rely on, but it is a very low bandwidth way of communicating, and it presents its own challenges. So operating drones, while it's feasible on one level, it's not something we as a nation are comfortable to do as something completely autonomous. We talk about autonomous vehicles. What we're really saying is, usually we're talking about semi-autonomous vehicles where there's a human in the loop. We haven't got to the point where we're comfortable with making it with no human in the loop. We're not there. And I, for good reason, think we shouldn't go there, where there should be humans in the loop for the operation of these systems that are potentially lethal. So if you have to have a human in the loop, then where is that human going to be? Probably on a submarine, okay? And the other one is the argument that, well, nuclear propulsion submarines are just so expensive, we surely can come up with a cheaper solution. And, there's been the argument we should have 40 diesel electric submarines at the same cost, if not less. And of course, I think I've torn that one apart already by the vulnerability that accrues with the diesel electrics. But the bottom line is, if we can barely crew 6 submarines, so the idea that we'd be able to crew 40 is, in my view, particularly unrealistic. But cost-wise, also, the figure that's been touted, 268 billion to 368 billion over 30 years, seems like an extraordinary amount of money. Firstly, we haven't been spending on that trajectory yet because the government has mandated defence to find the money out of hide. So Army and Air Force have had to sacrifice big budget cuts to enable Navy to take up a big part of the slack. So I think that leads to a much smaller figure over the medium term. Also, in the long run, when you think about, so let's say it is 368 billion over 30 years, what are we comparing it to? If you add up the money we'd be spending over 30 years on health, welfare, education, and social security, that's between $9 and $12 trillion over 30 years. Okay, so 368 billion, yeah, no question, it's a shed load of money. But what are we comparing it with? If we think about, is this part of the insurance policy of Defence of Australia? There is a premium you have to pay if you want to be a self-reliant, self-defendable country. And this is the irony, one of the great ironies of this, is that to be more self-reliant, we're reliant on American technology as the key enabler.
Yes, on that point, and you mentioned the difficulty that Australia currently has in crewing 6 small conventional boats. Our crews usually come mixed nowadays. We have a bunch of people on boards from Brits, Americans, Kiwis, and so on and so forth. Is there perhaps a danger in the command structure, the overall command structure that the Americans are setting up for us to run these boats, that we have no real control over these boats? They are, irrespective of what you just said, they are very high assets they're very high strategic assets. I would imagine that our ability, or an Australian government's ability to say, look, we've got these nuclear powered vessels, we're just going to go over here and do whatever we need to do to secure our national interest, that may not necessarily sit well with the Americans for whatever reason, that there could be a problem. Now, I see that that would be something that we'd need to take into consideration from that sovereignty risk perspective. What are your thoughts?
So I think it's similar with the F-35. When you purchase something, you own it. The United States, no one has raised this argument when it comes to the F-35, which is a US-built piece of technology with American hardware and American software. Very sophisticated piece of kit. a networked, super-enabled platform. It's not going to be remotely piloted by American, Air Force officers. It's Australian capability. When we get the Australian submarines, we will be operating as Australian assets that are subject to Australian government direction. This is a reflection of the trust that the United States is placing in Australia, that reflects something that Clare, Birgin and I wrote about in our book, Revealing Secrets, The Unofficial History of Australian Signals Intelligence and the Advent of Cyber. Basically, we've had 80 plus years of top secret trusted collaboration between Australia and the United States and the UK and other Five Eyes partners. This is the background noise of trust between our nations, where when the proposal for AUKUS was put to Joe Biden, having been VP for 8 years and president for several already, having seen what Australia brings to the top secret classified partnership, the trusted collaboration between our nations, he thinks, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's make it happen. So there are naysayers out there. There are critics who are saying, oh, the Americans won't trust us. They need it for themselves. They're operating too slowly. There's a couple of things there. One is that the American capability to build these subs is improving, and Australia is contributing to that. And Australia can actually contribute even more, particularly through the parts provision, the supply of componentry that is starting to happen. And the American resolve and commitment and financial commitment to the supply chain and flow through of manufacturing of submarines is on the increase, as is the case in the UK. So the other argument is, the United States won't be prepared to release the Virginia submarines to us. And there is a clause in the agreement, AUKUS agreement, whereby the president has to sign off that the United States doesn't need this. But talking to American officials in my occasional encounters with them and pundits in the know, there is a sense that this is a commitment in light of that trusted collaboration that goes beyond the ink on the agreement. Now, people can say, "Oh, John, you're drinking the Kool-Aid." In my view, this is my assessment of America's appreciation of its own national interests. It needs Australia. It can't afford for Australia to resent it and to lose faith in it as a key security partner, in large part because it needs us as the suitable piece of real estate more than ever. Now, my late great colleague Des Ball talked about Pine Gap as the suitable piece of real estate, and he was right, and that's still the case. But I would put to you that Fremantle is that second suitable piece of real estate, echoing the capability that existed in the Second World War when 170-odd Allied submarines operated from there, basically shortening the Pacific War considerably by their ability to interdict Imperial Japanese shipping and isolating the forces in the island chains to the north of Australia. Yep. That was a direct line of sight, the line of operating outside of range of their bombers, but within the ability of these submarines to operate with a degree of impunity that was not possible from other parts of the Pacific. So that capability, the geography remains, the utility of the real estate remains, and that I think is going to be a significant factor in the American calculations about whether they have nervousness about giving us 3 Virginia-class submarines. It's in their interests to make sure we have them.
John, our audience may not be aware of the fact that AUKUS isn't just one monolithic thing that we're dealing with. It actually has 2 parts. There's Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 1 obviously was what we've just spoken about, the build of nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. Can you explain to our audience what AUKUS Pillar 2 is all about?
So AUKUS Pillar 2 is really interesting. It's kind of capitalizing on a level of activity that was already starting to build between Australia and the United States, and to a certain extent with the United Kingdom and others, but has been supercharged by being put under this AUKUS label. So we're seeing work in hypersonics, collaboration on hypersonics. We're seeing work on artificial intelligence, on quantum computing, on precision-guided munitions, on PNT, precision navigation and timing, technologies that enable redundancy for precision navigation and operating when there's a compromise to the global positioning system. And considerable work on artificial intelligence and other technologies that are arising from the fourth industrial revolution, the digital revolution that we are experiencing these days. So no wonder that Pillar Two is actually something that even critics of AUKUS Pillar One are saying, well, yeah, that makes sense. We should do that bit. And even others are trying to get on the bandwagon. Here I'm thinking Japan, Korea, Canada, New Zealand, and others, trusted partners of the United States and of Australia that are eager to play in this space. And it is generating already significant opportunities for small to medium enterprises in Australia and in those countries to collaborate. It's generating opportunities in universities, in research institutions, in think tanks, in the Defence Science and Technology Group and beyond, to do things that have not been done before, or to accelerate what's already been happening. So it's by and large a positive. And as I say, when you're playing strategic competition, when unrestricted competition, it's no wonder you're going to get blowback, because some people don't want you to win this race. You know, some people actually really want you to come second. And well, we just need to be aware of that and not be put off by it, in my view.
John, recent reports indicate staff upheaval and frustrations within the agency overseeing AUKUS. How significant are these leadership challenges, and could they jeopardize the successful implementation of the submarine program?
So yeah, they could jeopardize it. But like any corporate activity, there's staff turnover, there's personality issues, there are challenges. But what we do see is there is a remarkable degree of resolve in the three governments of the three nations involved that has a surprising degree of bipartisan support. So across the aisle in Congress in the United States, an enthusiasm for AUKUS is almost unparalleled, unmatched by any other legislative agenda. Similarly, in the UK, we've seen a shift from the Conservatives to the Labor Party, and the enthusiasm for AUKUS remains. And of course, in Australia's context, we've seen, the Albanese government took office from a Conservative party, the coalition, and wholeheartedly adopted the proposal and has run with it ever since. So there's no question there are people on the fringes looking to shoot it down, to snipe at it and try and cancel Pillar Two. I think that would be a grave mistake. I think it's informed by a surprisingly and inaccurate, benign view of the degree of challenge we face today, the importance of us pursuing this with resolve, with determination, and with focus.
John, Australian defence acquisition has never been a happy topic. Concerns have been raised about the ambitious budget of AUKUS. How does this actually work on the $368 billion investment? Will it be managed effectively? And what safeguards are in place to avoid cost overruns? I mean, we've had a litany of defence acquisition disasters where, we signed up to pay X amount for a particular item and the cost just blew out completely, and it turned into a media firestorm, basically. So what can you say to give us some confidence that this process is not going to be repeated?
So I get what you're saying. I think there's a recognition in the governments of the three countries involved that we are facing, as I say, unrestricted competition. It's a strategic competition that is focusing the minds of officials in the three countries, that is driving a the she'll be right mate days of old are no longer appropriate for the circumstances we face. And yeah, to be fair, the risk remains that that could happen, that we could have a blowout in time and in cost and continued inefficiencies and, overruns and cancellations and delays. My sense is, though, that much like with, as I say, with the Sputnik moment, the competition is actually focusing the minds of many, and driving a realization that the kind of days of old, the good old days of the unipolar moment, where the cost overruns, the timeframes didn't really matter because there was no life and death challenge emerging at the end. We're facing now the kind of competition where the capabilities are not just nice to have, they're must-haves. And that's, I think, keeping people focused and driven to achieve this without, what cynics would say, and we've seen this in the past, to be fair, triple blowouts of costs, anticipated budgeted costs blowing out by a factor of 3. We can't afford that. No one can. It's critically important that government holds these corporations, the Australian Submarine Agency, strategic capabilities of the 3 countries. We need to be monitoring them closely, holding them to account, and ensuring that they deliver, and facilitating that as well along the way. And also not getting spooked by people who are looking to derail and sabotage the projects.
Speaking of which, there is one big elephant in the room that no one seems to be talking about, or at least they tiptoe around it when they talk about AUKUS, and that is America's own very real problems with shipbuilding. There's a skill shortage. They want to ramp up to try to sort of keep their competitive edge with the Chinese. The Chinese are churning out warships and submarines like sausages. What happened to American productive capabilities? And in this noticeable decline in American shipbuilding capabilities, how will this affect our ability to have nuclear-propelled submarines?
So it's a good question. And the post-Cold War decline, there was the so-called peace dividend that saw a real reduction in capabilities and the gutting of American shipbuilding. So there's been surprising here in the United States, surprising investment in recruiting people to work in shipyards and in submarine construction work. So there's a big push at the moment in the United States for people to be recruited into that space. And the electric boat and HII, Huntington Ingalls crowd, are being quite focused on doing this. I've had a little bit of engagement with them. They are quite determined to rise to the occasion. And there's also a recognition that there's some work that can be outsourced to others. So there's, I think, a place for countries like Australia to be component manufacturers that can actually help accelerate this. And of course, there's the work of countries like allies like Korea and Japan, who have a reputation for world-class, speedy, modern, efficient and effective shipbuilding and manufacture. That needs to be tapped into to help offset some of the challenges in the United States. But there is a trajectory. The US has gone through a bit of a low point, but the US is rallying, and the trajectory is, if it stays on the trajectory, a positive one. And as I say, the United States is quite motivated to stay on that trajectory. There's critics would say, the United States will implode before it gets these capabilities. I'm more sanguine about that. I've watched the movie Civil War. I get that there's a risk of things going a bit pear-shaped. People like to catastrophize, and there's no question there are risks of civil disorder. But the United States has been through challenges like this, perhaps not quite like this one, but similar challenges in the past. Its end has been predicted many times before, and so far all the predictions have been wrong, and I'm wagering that this one's wrong too.
John, there's been growing discussion around the possibility of expanding AUKUS to include South Korea and Japan, the two countries you've just mentioned, which could
Mm.
significantly strengthen the collective defense posture in the Indo-Pacific. What would be the strategic advantages and potential challenges of bringing South Korea and Japan into this partnership, and how might this shift the balance of power in East Asia?
So they don't have a real need to operate nuclear propulsion submarines because their maritime zones are much smaller than Australia. So they can operate with their independent propulsion system, which they're introducing, with a degree of confidence and robust capability sufficient for their needs without going. So Pillar One, I don't think is one that is all that likely, but in the Pillar Two space, there's a lot they can do. Because they've got advanced technologies in Japan and Korea. They're world leaders on a range of fronts and technologies that they have a contributing role to play. And the governments have shown enthusiasm. Their industries are enthused about it. So there is an opportunity for them to play constructively, particularly in the Pillar Two AUKUS space. It's worth just unpacking that a little bit too, because it's about, I think there's a certain prestige and kudos and for Korea and Japan to play in this space, and I think there's utility in encouraging that without us getting too worked up about it, mindful that bilateral and multilateral collaboration on advanced technologies and associated with the fourth industrial revolution are going to happen anyway, bilaterally or multilaterally. If we badge it AUKUS, then well and good. If it works for the Koreans and the Japanese and we do so, then let's make that happen. But it's going to be going on anyway, I think. And we've seen that in part with the fact that we've got Japanese defence manufacturers, Hanwha and the like, operating in Australia, working to have that capability shared here.
John, some people have said that the People's Republic of China, through its developments in quantum computing and AI, will soon make the seas transparent, giving submarines no place to hide, whether they're nuclear or conventional. Is this Chinese propaganda, or do you think this represents a very real risk?
So it doesn't seem to have slowed them down in manufacturing submarines,
Correct.
which to me suggests that they're not too optimistic about that prospect.
Yeah.
We haven't been able to find MH370. The ocean remains surprisingly opaque and difficult to communicate through, let alone peer through, to look through, to see through. I think, there's no question a lot of investment in research will continue apace in China and elsewhere to try and, find the chalice, the magic solution to underwater transparency. I'm not holding my breath to anticipate that. It is very difficult to see or to communicate below the waves.
Politically, some doyens of the Australian Labor Party, and here I'm talking about the likes of former Prime Minister Paul Keating and former New South Wales Premier Bob Carr, have both expressed their opposition to AUKUS as a general security arrangement and as a project to build nuclear-powered submarines. Both have expressed concerns over the potential loss of Australian sovereignty and that AUKUS is seen as a provocation to the People's Republic of China. Surely this makes for some awkward behind-the-scenes conversations on Australian national security and diplomacy within the Labor caucus. Is the Albanese government really behind this initiative of the former Morrison Liberal National Coalition government?
So I think the government is probably a little bit spooked by these Labor stalwarts being so hypercritical. But I think their concerns are misplaced. It's not a provocation to have submarines. We've had submarines for generations. We've operated them in the South China Sea for generations. What they're upset about is that this is the next generation, more capable version, something that they have themselves. They just don't want us to have it as well, right? They don't want this to be a level playing field. They want to have an advantage. So I think people who are saying that this is a provocation are buying into China's own rhetoric. And China, let's face it, they're very good at saying one thing and doing another. Everybody loves a good set of double standards, but they're very, very good at it. And we seem to be surprisingly naive about this and kind of swallow. They say things and we think, oh, that's true, that's terrible. We should pull our heads in, watch our P's and Q's, be more deferential. I'm thinking, below that, yes, be deferential, but not at the expense of capabilities critical to our own sovereignty and defence. And on this question of sovereignty, it's once again, there's a view out there that these submarines will be controlled by Washington. The whole point is it's a trusted exchange because based on the fact that we've been 80 years a trusted partner, that we make, and I'm a big fan of Shannon Tao's thesis on this, an independent ally that independently comes up with conclusions that often overlap with American interests. So we make choices that are in the pursuit of Australia's interests that often enough happen to align with US interests. America is banking on that being an enduring factor in Australia's calculation on its interests. And I think that that's a pretty solid bet.
Final question, John. AUKUS came about as a bit of deceptive politics from the former Morrison coalition government, throwing France under the bus in scrapping the French submarine deal and causing a temporary, though very sharp, breach in Canberra's relations with Paris. Do you think that we'll come to see this bit of unfortunate history as well worth it?
So it is very unfortunate the way France was treated over AUKUS. And I think there was scope for a nuclear submarine deal to have emerged with France. But it wasn't happening fast enough and it wasn't being proactively pursued. And now we are where we are, and there's a great line from Alice in Wonderland, if that's where you wanted to go, I wouldn't have started from here. But we are where we are. We have locked in ourselves to this proposal with the United States and United Kingdom. It's in our interest, I believe, now to pursue it. And if France has had the convenient advantage of having a change of government, so they're able to blame the previous government for what happened and make amends with the current government. And of course, in addition, France has an enduring interest in Australia being supportive of its policy in the Pacific. France has an Indo-Pacific strategy that centres on its possessions in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, not the least of which is New Caledonia. France actually needs Australia's support for its posture over New Caledonia. So this is the quid pro quo, if you like. We've just signed up to a renewed version of the France-Australia-New Zealand agreement, FRANZ, which sees Australia, New Zealand and France collaborating on regional security, humanitarian assistance, surveillance and other factors. That speaks to a recognition by France, by Paris, that, okay, let's bygones be bygones. We need to make this relationship work. It is in our interests to get on with Australia and with the United States, of course. And of course, they're getting on famously with the Brits. They have a bilateral defence pact with the Brits that enables them to do a lot of very close collaboration, much more than Australia. And that actually provides probably the benchmark for the kind of collaboration between France and Australia that we perhaps can aim for in the Pacific in future.
Just before we go, just sorry about this. A thought just occurred to me. We talk about all this highfalutin stuff, between the Chinese, the Americans, the Brits, the Australians, the French. What happened to the New Zealanders? Do they not matter anymore? We just don't seem to really bring them in, in an obvious capacity at least. Maybe they're silently working behind the scenes on a brilliant military-to-military relationship. I'm not suggesting that they're not, but from a PR perspective, they seem to always fall off the perch. We just don't hear about New Zealand's role in supporting Australia's AUKUS ambitions in any way, shape or form.
So Australia, surprisingly enough, is quite reliant on support from New Zealand, particularly in the Pacific. When we work with New Zealand, we work better than we do on our own. New Zealand's a really critical partner to Australia's engagement in the Pacific. This is in the context of the Pacific Islands Forum. It's in the context of crisis response to issues in the past in East Timor, in Solomon Islands, in Bougainville, and elsewhere in the Pacific. We work better when we work together. We're also working closely with New Zealand in the five-power defence arrangement with Malaysia and Singapore and the UK. So Australia, New Zealand, the collaboration, we have the closer economic relations, CER, between Australia and New Zealand, where it doesn't make the headlines because it's not controversial. The Australia relationship with New Zealand is a healthy one. It's a positive one. It's not controversial. Headlines are made by controversies, and it's not in the headlines, partly for that reason.
John Blaxland, thanks for joining us and for sharing your insights on the focus.
Great to be with you, John. Thank you for having me on the program.
That was Australian commentator, author, and Australian national security expert working for the Australian National University, Professor John Blaxland. Thank you for joining me, John Brewin, for today's episode with John Blaxland. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about John and connect with him on social media. Do you believe AUKUS strengthens Australia's security, or do you share the concerns about sovereignty and potential involvement in conflicts not of our making? How do you feel about the financial investment in nuclear propulsion submarines? Do you think this is a necessary expenditure, or should Australia focus on other defence capabilities? Do you think Australia's regional neighbours are comfortable with AUKUS, or are we potentially alienating key partners in Southeast Asia with this deal? Given the leadership and internal challenges within the AUKUS submarine agency, are you confident in the project's successful completion, or do you foresee major obstacles again? Tell us in the show notes what you think about all these and other issues that may come to you on AUKUS. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producers of The Focus, Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor and follow The Focus on X at @thefocus_sage. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.